How's it going, everyone? Thanks for joining. So I'd love to get kicked off. We throw around the term institutions a lot. I think a lot of people have different perspectives on what an institution is. Can you give your perspective or thoughts on when we say institution, the types of companies that we're talking about, how they differ from each other, and why it's important that they start coming on chain now? Alex?
Well, I think we're talking about institutions, right? We're talking about these macro structures that support all of our traditional financial systems, governments, all this sort of stuff. Why is it important that they come on chain? Well, if you think about the global assets that exist in the world, if you think about the scale of that, the size of that relative to where we are right now as an industry, I think you see that it would represent a massive increase, right? And them coming on chain, I think also will convey a legitimacy and a validation that this technology is in fact better, right? And I think we're seeing this at an insanely accelerated rate. We're seeing things like global FX and payments processing coming on chain, and the fact that we can offer a product and a service that's better than what these institutions can do right now with their millions of dollars, with their hundreds of employees, with global branches and all that sort of stuff. And so for them to come on chain, for them to start building in on-chain ways, to issue new assets on chain, I think will cause this industry to grow by, orders of magnitude.
So you had mentioned payments as one use case, RWAs get thrown around. What do you think the most important use case that we should be focused on for institutions is? Charles?
I think something that gets overlooked is the entry point to all of this, which is payments and proof POS systems. And around over 60% of the GDP of Canada, over 40-something% of the US is small businesses. So I think when small businesses actually get plugged into the financial institutions and they're working together on chain, that's when the real skill starts.
Doomy, curious your perspective on this from the X-Layer side?
Sure. Of course, we would want to have as many users on X-Layer as possible, right? And I can comment from the engineering perspective. What we are doing in X-Layer is we try to have a very good performance in terms of, for example, transactions per second, but also to reduce the latency, right? So I think payments is one area where the latency matters, right? So we are focusing on that part. Yeah.
I think it's pretty obvious to us that these new systems are net better than the existing systems. What do you think some of the biggest challenges that have stopped these institutions from already adopting crypto have been?
Well, I think the way things have worked up until today has worked very well for them. And so I see this very much as this on-chain revolution is really no different than the revolution we saw in early computing and early internet, right? Institutions, traditional businesses, they're slow to move. They don't even know they're being disrupted as it's happening. So I think one thing has just been that it makes sense that they move slow because that's always what happens with incumbents. But of course, the other thing has been legal and regulatory, right? There's been an extraordinary amount of risk in doing anything on-chain. There was a very adversarial relationship in the United States, which prevented many of them. But I think that is one of the points of friction, right, that we're expecting to be removed, especially if we get the market structure bill. And I think what you're seeing right now is on crypto Twitter, even in the last week, the number of job postings for senior hiring, right, in these institutions for people focused on getting these institutions on chain, it seems like it just exploded, right?
Totally.
Which I assume is in part in anticipation of market structure. But again, it's also a validation that they're beginning to recognize these present either opportunities or threats if they don't respond to them. But one of my observations was that unless they are hiring these people at the C-suite level, I don't think they're moving fast enough. because you can't slot this in a traditional organization.
Yeah.
In a vertical that threatens every other vertical. They need to be up there at the top.
I think everything we've seen from these institutions has been proofs of concept, small research groups, but C-suite executives is signaling a very different sort of perspective and take on where they're going in the near term. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add on to that, the talent gap is definitely a big issue when it comes to moving faster there. But one area, and it's a little more biased to my recent conversations, but it's around just risk frameworks in general and how we classify assets in DeFi. And if you look at TradFi, there's commodities, equities, bonds, everything, all with their own scoring, all with the exact way to translate it to retail. And I think if we can, in general, DeFi is just one big question mark for most people. So we can have better risk frameworks, consolidation there, even risk scoring, like AAA bonds style for DeFi. It will go a long way for just onboarding asset managers and then retail and so on. So I'd like to see more coordination around that. It's something I'd like to work on as well.
How do you think that starts to interplay with degen activity on chain, sort of like the intersection of TradFi with like this more open, permissionless, decentralized world that we're trying to build?
I think what we're going to see is an explosion of, you could call them better asset types, or you could just call them more traditional asset types. That would be everything from global stables and this whole FX infrastructure. But I also think it means equities, it means commodities, it means all these things. And now the upside, what makes them better is these markets are real time. These markets are permissionless. These markets are composable. They are 24/7. They're globally accessible. And for all of these institutions, that presents a massive upside. And this is where the regulation piece comes in right now, because there's been such a struggle, right, to bring some of these RWAs or traditional asset types on chain in a way that bootstraps enough liquidity for actually generating usage, right? Because they might need to be in a KYC pool. But who's going to come trade in this KYC pool? Who's going to provide liquidity on it? It's been an issue. And now, if we get more clarity, and I am hopeful here that we will be able to bring, say, a representation of a stock on chain, and it might have things like voting rights. It might be able to register when a split happens, and that you can also take that and deposit it into a lending protocol. You can access that from no matter where you are in the world. It's just going to fundamentally change the game.
So you're effectively able to take all of the legal constructs of TradFi today, bring them on crypto rails that provide a lot of the advantages around composability, 24/7 access, global distribution, and sort of get the best of both worlds in that way?
Yeah, and to your question on how does this intersect with the degen world, I think we're just talking about the world's best marketplace existing, because you will have everything from the most boring tokenized index fund to meme coins to everything in between, all in one place, real time, globally accessible.
I think one of the biggest challenges that we've heard from institutions that we talk to as they start to come on chain are scaling issues related to liquidity and slippage, and also latency. Dumi, you mentioned latency is one of the things that you all are focused on. Can you say a little bit more about why you think this is so important for these institutions to come on chain?
Well, I can comment mostly from our perspective, where actually we want to use the pay product on X layer. So for that, we want to have as lower latency as possible. Yeah, and what we did is basically we are using flash blocks, and with that we reduce the confirmation time from right now we have 1 second block time on layer 2, and with flash blocks we reduce the confirmation time to 200 milliseconds. Yeah. I think this is from the perspective of performance. Of course, I think liquidity is also something that really matters. Yeah.
Yeah, something I found quite interesting just talking to institutions over the past 6 months is the block time finality isn't as important, right? Because like you can have the token layer execute as fast as possible, but that's only part of the equation. A big part of it is the finality on the compliance and legal side, which could take hours to days. So for RWAs in general, it's not as big of an input for what they're considering, but for anything that's like high latency, like trading strategies, MEV, and everything like that, it's super important. But like then again, those are two different audiences, so they might go in different directions.
Can you say more about some of the finality around compliance with RWAs?
I mean, I think it just like replicates what happens in TradFi around like legal contracts, like custody, non-custody, and different things on that requirement list. And it takes time, and it's not rushed, and it will never be rushed. And a lot of it is off-chain. So until you can bring it on-chain, I think maybe it's not as important, but I like to see it move on-chain if possible.
Yeah. In terms of liquidity, how are you guys thinking about this? How are you focused on institutional flows compared to retail flows? How does that differ within Velo and Arrow today? How are you thinking about that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, liquidity is really the thing we have to solve for, right? Because you can have this real-time, globally accessible market, all the transaction times, but if you cannot trade assets in sufficient size, they will not gain adoption. So this is our entire focus.
Yeah.
And there's a few ways that we're attacking it. One is, so we announced last fall MetaDex 03 and our new DEX Arrow, which will expand across all of Ethereum. And liquidity up until this point across Ethereum, as it's scaled into these fragmented L2s and all of that, has been very challenging. Challenging from a UX standpoint of, hey, I'm just a user and I want to trade a token.
Totally.
How do I find it? Do I have to go a bridge? I didn't bridge gas. Now I got to do that. Which DEX do I use? And that's one thing we're going to solve for. One single UI, UX. You see every single token anywhere on Ethereum and all of the cross-chain aggregation, all the cross-chain bridging, swapping, all done in one click. So that's one thing we're going to solve on the UX side. But this is also important for asset issuers, right? Whether it's a RWA, whether it's a protocol token, anything like that. It's basically been the case of you have to think about how do I get sufficient liquidity
Absolutely.
on Base,
Yeah.
on Ethereum mainnet, on Arc, on OP mainnet, and that's a very expensive problem. And usually what it ends up doing is you don't really have good liquidity in any particular place. And in having this, it's called meta swaps, and abstracting that away is that I think it's going to be far less important for issuers to worry about necessarily where their token is issued. They need to pick one place that's right for them. And I think for some that'll be like the L1. That'll make sense. Drop it on mainnet. That's where core liquidity lives. For others, it might be like something like Arc or Base. But they can just now focus on scaling their liquidity in that one place. And we will ensure that anyone seeking that liquidity can access it anywhere their origin point is on Ethereum.
So you're effectively allowing asset issuers to consolidate liquidity in one location and export that and make that accessible to token holders on other chains in a way that reduces slippage and makes these markets more efficient.
Exactly. And for the chains themselves, I mean, you guys know this better than anybody. It's like, what does every new L2 in the OP stack have to do? Or even Alt L1, spend a ton of money getting liquidity on Wrapped ETH USDC.
Totally.
And a few other core pairs. And they spend money doing that, recreating the same liquidity, rather than investing in what their niche and differentiating sort of thing is. And that's the other thing we'll take the burden off of, because it can just route cross-chain through that core Wrapped ETH pool and then focus you coming out on, say, a FX pair that only exists on that chain.
Totally. How do you think that this is going to interplay with more of these institutions launching their own L2s over time? Do you expect them to be issuing their custodial assets on an L2 that they're launching, growing it there? How do you think this is going to shake out?
I mean, from my experience, most institutions and fintechs and all the players in that space have really just wanted to control the entry point and the settlement layer. The big problem is actually the middle part of that cookie, and that's DeFi and the app layer. And so I think the bigger problem is like, how do you actually incentivize these apps and DeFi to come in when you don't have a token? Even if you have a token, it's short term, doesn't last forever, so you have to work through that. And I think the institutions should play to the advantage of distribution. They have access to millions of users. With the entry point and settlement layer, they can attract these DeFi teams by getting users, and that is a symbiotic relationship. So,
Doomy, how are you guys thinking about that at XLayer relationship to the users of OKX and sort of bridging that gap to allow these protocols access to all of OKX's users?
I mean, of course, right? We will want to see the users of the CeFi side joining the X layer, right? But I mean, it's not so easy to do that. But I mean, from the engineering perspective, right? We are focusing on building the best infrastructure and also trying to bring in more users and also more developers. So I think at OKX we are really, I mean, at least in the DeFi side, right? We are really focusing on open source, and we are contributing a lot to the open source. So actually, you can see that on our GitHub repositories. Yeah. So we are really trying to focus on developers.
Last area I'd love to touch on is trust and safety for these institutions. They are very accustomed to working through many, many highly regulated middlemen, whether it's custodians or clearing houses. How do you think we can push this farther forward to really ensure that as these institutions come on chain, they're able to transact in a way that meets the trust and safety requirements that they're accustomed to right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think one layer of this is, of course, this is why proliferation of chains that are making different assumptions, right, is very important, right? Because the entry point for some institutions might be a chain like even Alto one like Circle's Arc, where they feel like, hey, I don't need to know much about this Ethereum thing. You're coming onto EVM, so we're getting them hooked. But they know they can call Jeremy if there's an issue, right? And that's great. And others will go more to the extreme of trust and safety, and all this stuff for them is going to mean it's actually secure and neutral and all this sort of stuff. But everything else in this line, I think is going to come down to products like in our new AMM. You'll have the option of plugging in any number of different verification stacks, for instance. And right now we don't really have a definitive verification stack. I think it's still a question of how much liquidity and activity will need to live in those versus not, and that's where the legal and regulatory piece will come in. But it's important that the technology sort of meets each institution where they are, because I think the overall trajectory will be towards this permissionless, neutral world, but we need to meet them where they are.
Very much meeting them with all their compliance regulatory obligations today, and slowly but surely, step by step, helping them understand the benefits of fully permissionless systems.
yeah, I think they can pretty much replicate everything that they want that they have in TradFi. And so the bigger issue is just the education and strengthening of security on the on-chain side. So that's like reducing any vulnerabilities, not just smart contract risk, but like runtime enforcement risk. So like there's projects that are actually trying to do a lot of these security checks at the chain level. And I think if you can actually do that and remove it from entering the block space, it actually gives a lot more trust in the whole system. So once you have like security that is more baseline there, they won't worry as much as the smart contract risk, which is a huge question mark for them as well. So I think it's spending more time on that than the actual stuff that they can already just replicate pretty easily.
Awesome. I think we are just about out of time. Thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you.